Have you ever had the feeling of being watched? There's nothing quite like that feeling. There's this almost primal sense that something isn't quite right, but at the same time your brain is telling you it's probably nothing. A far worse feeling, though, is the fear of realizing that you were actually being watched. In the months preceding April of 1922, a family felt exactly that, and what followed would be one of the most horrifying events in German history. So although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they're still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. In a heavily forested area just outside the village of Gruber in the German state of Bavaria, quiet was something people were used to, but it wasn't always that way. Just several years had passed from the end of World War I, and residents here could still recall the distant sounds of mortar explosions and rifle fire. Thankfully, that time had passed, and things returned to the way they were, or at least mostly. In this area dotted by farmlands, as you might imagine, although life was mostly quiet and slow, there was also such thing as too quiet. After all, a life in agriculture was generally one of hard work that never seemed to end. So when one particular farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck fell silent for a few days in the spring of 1922, it was impossible for neighbors not to notice. The farm, which was built in 1863, was home to the Gruber family, including the 63-year-old father Andreas, his wife, 72-year-old Kazilia, their 35-year-old daughter Victoria, and her two children, 7-year-old Silly and 2-year-old Joseph. They were known to be a bit reclusive and were rarely seen in the village, but the farm itself was normally filled with activity, as there was always some part of the property that needed attention, whether the animals had to be fed or the fields had to be plowed. On April 1st, 2 coffee sellers visited the remote property to take the family's usual order, but their knocks on the doors and windows of the farmhouse went unanswered. Before this, the vendors had never encountered the farm so quiet, and the eeriness of the surroundings unnerved them. Strange as this might have been, however, they figured it was just a rare time no one was home and left the property. As the weekend came and went, concern in the village grew when the Grubers, who were always a fixture at Sunday worship services, failed to show up for church. Suspicion then started to move through the small community even more when word spread that young Celia was absent from school for a few days without excuse. But it wouldn't be until April 4th when enough of an alarm was raised to merit checking on the family. That morning, local mechanic Albert Hoffner arrived at Hinterkaifeck to repair a piece of machinery. And expecting to be greeted by Andreas as he usually was on his visits, Albert encountered a scene similar to one the coffee vendors experienced just a few days earlier. He then called out to the family but heard only the restless sounds of farm animals in the barn and the incessant howling of the family dog. The state of the farm was a bit odd to Albert, but he hung out for more than an hour, expecting Andreas or one of the family members to make themselves known. When that didn't happen, he proceeded to perform the work he was tasked with, all the while remaining aware of his unusual surroundings. Then, when the necessary repairs were finished and still no sign of any of the Grubers, Albert left the property with an uneasy feeling. Now, sitting just a few hundred yards away from Hinterkaifeck was a farm belonging to local mayor Loren Schlittenbauer, who was among those who had taken note of the Grubers' strange absence. After hearing about Albert's lonely visit to the property that morning, Lorenz decided it was well past time to investigate. He was certain everything was fine, but confirmation of that would at least bring an end to the concern of worried neighbors. So along with 2 other men, Lorenz made his way to Hinterkaifeck and decided to start by checking out the barn, where the animals inside seemed particularly agitated. The 3 then cautiously crept up to the barn door, calling out to Andreas and receiving no reply. After opening the door and stepping inside, Lorenz and his 2 companions discovered a disturbing scene that is one of the most infamous in true crime history. Stacked near each other and partially covered in hay and a piece of door that had been sawed off were the bodies of Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, and Silly, and it was immediately clear that whatever happened to them had been ruthless. After seeing this, Lorenz went over to the farmhouse and tried to enter, only to find the doors locked. He then pulled out a key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Upon entering, the farmhouse was completely silent, and as Loren moved about the home, he found Joseph in his bassinet, covered by one of his mother's dresses. When he pulled the cloth back, he found a single circular puncture wound. Then in another room, he found the body of Maria Baumgartner, the Gruber's live-in maid, who had tragically just started working for the Grubers on March 31st. After Lorenz made the horrific and shocking discovery, he and the 2 men left the property to phone the police, and the case was handed over to Inspector George Gruber, who was a detective with a solid reputation for closing cases. The scene at Hinterkaifeck, however, would be a challenge right from the beginning. During the discovery of the bodies, Lorenz had moved several of them. According to his statement to police, he initially found Andreas face down but flipped him over. He also claimed to have moved Silly from her original position too. These actions would eventually cast suspicion on him, but well before then, George and his department made several unexpected discoveries. It became chillingly clear after a search of the property that the perpetrator had not only committed the unspeakable acts, but had also lingered on the property for several days afterward. Inside the farmhouse, the remnants of freshly prepared meals and recently consumed bread were apparent. The cattle had also been fed, and the home bore the undeniable sign someone was living there. Based on witness statements and information the police gathered about the stillness of the farm in the days before the bodies were discovered, it was determined that the incident most likely took place on the evening of March 31st. Disturbingly though, in the kitchen was a tearaway day calendar with the date updated to reflect April 1st, 1922. Autopsies were then performed on each of the victims and took place right inside the barn on a makeshift examination table, and it was here that the brutality was fully apparent. Andreas' face was found to be mangled with his cheekbones cracked and exposed. Kazelia had blunt trauma to her head, leaving her with a cracked skull. Victoria's skull had similar wounds along with marks around her neck. Little Cilly's injuries included a broken jaw, and clumps of her own hair were found in her clenched hands. And finally, Maria's face was disfigured, similar to Andreas's. Every detail of the scene pointed to a perpetrator who had acted with both precision and intent, or maybe even outright rage, making the motive unclear on that first look. Then, following the autopsies, each of the victims' heads were sent to Munich for further examination. The conclusion by the physician who conducted the autopsies was that the weapon had been some type of agricultural tool like a mattock, which is similar to a pickaxe. Further search of the property then revealed more haunting details. In the hayloft inside the barn was a scene that suggested someone had been occupying it for some time. Hay bales had been stacked up in interesting ways, and some of the roof tiles had been removed, giving whoever was staying there a view of the entire farm. Carpet was even placed on the floor and theorized to be a tactic that would dampen the intruder's footsteps. Ropes in the hayloft had also been attached to the beams throughout the barn, leading George and his team to believe this was a system for the perpetrator to lower himself to the ground quickly in case a hasty escape was required. And then all of this was punctuated by a pile of human waste and discarded rinds of smoked meat located near the lookout area. During the initial search as well of the crime scene and the rest of the property, there was no weapon found. But almost a year after the incident, hinterkaifeck was torn down, and during the process, several more finds were made. During the teardown, the blood-stained mattock, which had been a tool that Andres had made himself for killing livestock, was located above the kitchen under a few false floorboards. A bloody iron band and a knife were also uncovered in the barn during the teardown, and who they belonged to was initially unclear. But either way, it all painted an incredibly disturbing picture. Someone had seemingly lived on the family's property, watching them and waiting before eventually striking. Then afterward, lived in their home and ate their food. From all of this information, there were far more questions than answers, and namely, who could have perpetrated such a vicious and brutal incident? So far as anyone knew, the Grubers didn't have any enemies. Again, they were known to keep to themselves, but as the investigation wore on, more strange details came to light. At first, George and his department worked off the possibility that the murders were the result of a robbery gone wrong. Interrogations were then conducted with traveling workmen, wanderers, and anyone else meriting suspicion, but when police found large sums of undisturbed money on the property, the botched robbery theory was dismissed. And considering the strangeness of the events that preceded the murders, such a straightforward explanation wouldn't satisfy anyway. Something even creepier was then learned. In the months and weeks leading up to the incident, there were some odd things happening on the farm. 6 months before, the Grubers had a different live-in maid named Crescens Rieger who abruptly quit. When she was tracked down and questioned by police, she told investigators that her quitting was the result of strange noises she kept hearing from the attic in the farmhouse. And when pressed further on the topic, Crescens revealed that she believed the house to be haunted, although in hindsight there could have certainly been a much more realistic explanation given the evidence found in the hayloft. And she wasn't the only one to notice peculiarities in the property either. Victoria complained of feeling like she was being watched and hearing the same voices and footsteps in the attic that caused Crescens to quit. Police also learned that just before the incident, Andreas found a strange newspaper from Munich on the property but couldn't determine where it originated from. He first believed that the mailman might have delivered it accidentally, but in talking to him, Andreas learned that no one in the area was a subscriber to that particular newspaper. On top of that, on the morning of March 30th, so the day before it's believed the murders occurred, Andreas went about his workday, which began with an inspection of the farm. And near the barn was a motor shed, which was normally locked, but that morning Andreas found the lock had been broken. And even stranger, the night before, a snowstorm had come through the area and there were footprints leading to the shed, but none leading away from it. Upon inspection though, Andreas found nothing unusual and no one in the shed. Understandably, the family was apparently very concerned about this discovery, but Andreas assured everyone that things were fine. But then again, later that night, some of the family members heard footsteps coming from the attic. But once again, upon going to the attic to investigate, Andreas found nothing and no one up there. Somewhere around this time, the family also found that one of the 2 keys to the house had disappeared. The reason all of this is known is that Andreas told all this to several people that day who urged him to contact the police about the potential intrusions. But tragically, Andreas didn't tell the police about the strange things that had been going on. And in fact, the oddities didn't stop there either. In the process of interviewing locals, police turned up two interesting statements. The first came from a farmer and butcher who was on his way home around 3 o'clock on the morning of April 1st when he passed hinterkaifeck. As he did, he noticed two figures at the edge of the forest near the property, and once he spotted them, they turned their backs to him as if to conceal their identities. Another statement came from a man named Michael, who was also passing by the farm in the night hours after the murders were believed to have taken place. According to Michael, he noticed that there was smoke coming from the hinterkaifeck farmhouse chimney, but the smoke seemed to smell different than the usual and was quite unpleasant. He compared it almost to the scent of burning rags. Michael also described seeing someone with a lantern coming toward him on the street from the driveway, but said that the light blinded him just enough to not be able to tell who it was, and he didn't stick around long enough to find out either. He apparently got spooked by this and quickly continued on his way. Police, however, didn't find this account to be convincing enough to look into it, and there was never any investigation into what, if anything, was burned in the fireplace. Now, beyond all of the incredibly disturbing stuff that happened leading up to the incident, the other thing that makes this case so strange is all of the suspects that have been put forward in the centuries since it occurred. For the first and possibly strongest of the suspects, what we have is a set of facts that paint a scandalous picture of what life was really like on the farm before the incident took place, and it all centered around Victoria and her 2-year-old son Joseph. As World War I was getting underway in 1914, Victoria married a man named Karl Gabriel, who went off to fight for Germany. However, he was killed during a shell attack in France and his body was never recovered. Joseph, however, was born in 1919, so it was obvious that Karl could not have been his father, so rumors quickly spread in the village about Joseph's true father. One theory was that Joseph was the product of Victoria's troubling relationship with her father, Andreas, and there's even some disturbing evidence to support this. In 1915, Andreas and Victoria were convicted of this relationship, with Andreas serving a year in prison and Victoria a month. And while suspicions lingered that the mistreatment by Andreas continued afterward, it was never proven. But either way, this fueled speculation. At the same time, many villagers believed Joseph's father was in fact Loren's. After his first wife's death in 1918, Lorenz entered a relationship with Victoria, and both even referred to Joseph as his son publicly for a time. They were reportedly planning to marry until Andreas objected. Some accounts also suggest Lorenz may have played a role in bringing the original charges against Andreas, though he later withdrew his claim of being Joseph's father. The result of all of this was a tense and complicated dynamic between Lorenz and the Gruber family. As a result as well, Lorenz came under suspicion of the police pretty quickly for this and a number of other reasons. Again, when he and his two companions entered the barn on April 4th to find the family, Lorenz moved the bodies from their original position. When questioned about this, Lorenz apparently said he was looking for his son Joseph among the bodies. That alone is strange enough, but he also apparently carried himself with what was seen as an uncaring, almost nonchalant demeanor, like he wasn't startled by what they found. Then, after finding the bodies in the barn, he left his two companions there and went alone to investigate the farmhouse. According to his own account, he found the door locked but was able to get inside. Some reports even later said he had a key, which raised eyebrows since the Grubers had reported one missing just days before. Investigators obviously found it curious that Lorenz would have access at all, given his strained relationship with Andreas. But in truth, the two had a complicated relationship and apparently still respected each other as neighbors. In fact, Andreas had even gone to Lorenz for advice when he discovered these strange footprints leading to the shed. The final piece of strangeness around Lorenz came in 1925, well after hinterkaifeck was torn to the ground. While at the ruins of the farm, he allegedly told another man that the killer had tried to bury the bodies in the barn but couldn't because the ground was frozen too hard to dig. This comment was unsettling since it wasn't in the 1922 police reports. If he was speculating, it was a weirdly specific thing to say. Lorenz had also only been questioned once, the day after the murders were discovered, and then not again until 1931. But even so, when he was questioned again years later, the authorities ultimately cleared him, dismissing the odd remarks and behavior as the result of shock. After Lorenz, though, frustratingly, the trail of potential suspects is only loosely connected to the family, and the connections are primarily based on hearsay. Almost 30 years after the murders, the case had gone nowhere. Then in 1951, a woman named Crescentia on her deathbed made an extraordinary claim. She claimed her own brothers Adolf and Anton Gump had killed the Grubers at hinterkaifeck. A prosecutor named Andreas Popp, who was working the case at the time, then began digging into this accusation. As he did, he became convinced that Adolf had been romantically involved with Victoria and even heard some rumors that he was the real father of Joseph. But there was a problem. He was already dead, having passed away in 1944. That left Anton, the surviving brother, to face the prosecutor's questions. The prosecutor then traveled to his city to catch Anton off guard, hoping a surprise interrogation would rattle him into confessing. Anton, however, calmly explained that he'd worked as a farmhand over the years, listing villages, farms, and visits to his brother. When it became clear what the prosecutor was hinting at, though, Anton flatly denied everything. Still, he was arrested briefly and his wife was questioned again and again, but nothing came of it. In the end, it all fizzled and the case against Anton was dropped in 1954. 2 decades later, in 1971, another curious lead surfaced, this time from a letter. A woman named Therese wrote about something she had witnessed as a 12-year-old girl. She remembered her mother receiving a visit from another woman, the mother of 2 brothers named Carl and Andreas Schreier, who lived nearby. According to Therese, the woman sat in her kitchen and admitted that her sons were the murderers at Hinterkaifeck, and she recalled the mother mentioning one strange detail. This was apparently that one of the brothers, Andreas, regretted losing a penknife during the killings. This sounded like the kind of memory too specific to ignore, and investigators were intrigued, especially since a pocket knife had actually been found years earlier when the farm was demolished in 1923. By the time Therese's letter reached authorities, though, nearly 50 years had passed since the murders, and any chance of tracing the knife back to Carl or Andreas was long gone. So after the Schreiers, the next set of brothers is the Bischler brothers, Anton and Carl. Their names came up thanks to the former maid at Hinterkaifeck, Crescens. She never trusted the brothers, and she apparently wasn't exactly shy about saying so. Anton in particular had worked the potato harvest at Hinterkaifeck and knew the farm well. He also had some choice words for the family. According to Crescens, Anton often spoke about the Grubers, muttering that the whole family ought to be dead. The Gruber family dog also piqued the interest of the former maid. The dog apparently barked at everyone except Anton. That tiny detail stuck in Crescens' mind, as it was reported that the dog was silent on the night of the murders. She even went so far as to tell her priest that she believed the Bischlers had done it. She apparently even tried to alert the police, but she said nobody listened. By the time she made an official statement later on, she emphasized just how much Anton and Carl hated Andreas Gruber in particular. He was notoriously difficult to work for, not to mention the cloud of scandal from the rumors involving Victoria. However, although they were suggested as possible suspects, the brothers seem to have never been properly investigated, and the lead ultimately went cold. The final set of brother suspects, the Tollers, already had a reputation for petty burglaries. However, once again, it was Crescens, the former maid, who drew the connection. She claimed that Joseph Toller once appeared outside her window at night, peering in from the darkness and asking questions about the Gruber family. But although that would be unsettling, since Crescens also made similar accusations about other men in the village and her testimony is the only source for this encounter, it is generally dismissed today as hearsay. All of this leads us to one final suspect, and one that has no connection to the family at all. A book called The Man from the Train, published in 2017, puts forward an interesting theory that connects the Hinterkaifeck murders to a series of unsolved axe murders that span multiple American states during the late 19th and 20th centuries. The author proposes that the perpetrator behind all the crimes was a German immigrant named Paul Mueller, who had been the prime suspect in the 1898 killing of a family in Massachusetts. This killer appeared to use train routes to travel between the states where the crimes took place, and there were some striking correlations between Paul's suspected crimes and the Hinterkaifeck incident. These similarities include the deaths of entire families in their secluded homes, the use of the blunt side of a farm tool as a weapon, the deliberate arrangement of victims including covering them up, the perpetrator staying behind at the crime scene for some time afterward, and the lack of robbery as a motive. Among these cases linked to Paul by the author is the infamous Vasila axe murders, which saw a family savagely attacked in their Iowa home. The author also notes that the spree attributed to Paul seems to abruptly end before 1920. To bring this all together, he then speculates that Paul might have returned to Germany around 1912, possibly to evade mounting suspicion as police and journalists began to identify patterns in the incidents. But, while intriguing, this theory, like all the others, remains unproven, and the Hinterkaifeck slayings persist as one of history's most baffling murder mysteries. The investigation formally concluded in 1955 with no charges ever brought against any suspects. So, in the end, you have a family who reported a series of extremely strange and disturbing occurrences on their little farm. This included the feeling of being watched, footsteps in the snow, and eventually someone seeming to have lived in their barn and watched them for some time. This all occurred shortly before they were all found to have been killed in a horrific way. Then, it almost seems as though whoever did it lived in their house for some time afterward. But despite all of this, although there were many suspects, the evidence wasn't quite there for anyone. So as a result, Hinterkaifeck remains one of the most confusing, unsolved cases to have ever taken place. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.